You always imagined it would feel like a breakthrough. That once you awakened, once you saw the truth, your life would light up like sunrise after a storm. Purpose, passion, power. But then one morning, you opened your eyes, and the world felt dim, not dark, just muted. You weren't sad. You weren't broken. You were just quiet. Nothing pulled you out of bed. Nothing moved you the way it used to. And the strangest part? You weren't confused. You understood the illusion. You saw the gains. You knew what wasn't real anymore. So why did everything suddenly feel so empty? What you're feeling, this silence, this stillness, this strange inner pause, it's not failure. Carl Jung saw it coming. He didn't call it awakening. He called it transformation. And before the transformation takes form, there's a death, not of your body, but of who you thought you were. And that's what this video is about. Because if you're sitting in the quiet right now, you're not lost. You're standing at the edge of the most sacred doorway of your life. And this might just be the map your soul has been waiting for. Somewhere along the path, something cracked open. Maybe after a retreat, maybe during a heartbreak, maybe in the stillness of a long sleepless night. And suddenly, you saw the lies, the patterns, the masks. And for a moment, it was like the world lifted off your shoulders. You had awakened, but then, something unexpected happened. Not a crisis, not a breakdown, just a slow, quiet unraveling. At first, you stopped pushing, then you stopped planning, and eventually, you stopped caring. Not in a reckless way, but in that deep, echoing kind of numbness, where the things that once gave you fire now barely give you a flicker. You look at your goals, your dreams, your carefully crafted 5-year plan, and all you feel is stillness. People around you try to help. Maybe you're just burned out. Take a break. But you know, this isn't burnout. This is something else. It's like your old fuel tank went empty, but no one ever told you there was a different kind of energy source. And so, you sit there, awake, clear-eyed, and completely unmotivated. The voice inside starts to whisper, "Why do I feel so disconnected, now that I finally see clearly? Why does truth come with such a quiet ache?" This is the paradox of awakening, the part no one talks about. The part most spiritual quotes skip, but Carl Jung, he knew. He knew that when the unconscious becomes conscious, the world doesn't suddenly feel more alive. It often feels more hollow. At least for a while. Because when your illusion dies, something in you dies with it. The old identity, the one that chased, strived, hustled, is now gone. And all that's left is the pause before the next breath. We've been told that awakening means arrival. That once we see the truth, everything will feel aligned. But for many, especially those who feel deeply, who reflect deeply, awakening feels more like erosion. I remember a friend. Deeply spiritual, read all the right books, practiced all the right things. And one day, after a brutal, soul-breaking night, she said, "I get it now. I don't need to prove anything. I don't need to win." She had arrived at what so many seek, detachment from the false self. But weeks later, I found her lying in bed, blank stare, frozen hands, not depressed, not broken, just missing. She looked at me and whispered, "I used to cry because I couldn't do enough. Now I don't care if I do anything at all. What happened to me?" And that's when I realized she didn't fail her awakening. She walked too far into it, without a guide. Because no one tells you that when the ego dies, so does your relationship with external meaning. Carl Jung didn't write Instagram quotes. But he did say something profound. Enlightenment doesn't come by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And that darkness isn't just shadows from the past. It's the emptiness that follows when your life loses all its previous labels, goals, labels, all of it, dissolves. And without that scaffolding, motivation vanishes. Not because you're lazy, but because the you that needed motivation is gone. You're not malfunctioning, you're rebooting. And yes, it feels hollow. Because you're standing in the echo chamber of your old life. No applause. No deadlines. No ego to impress anyone. Just you and the silence. And this silence, as uncomfortable as it is sacred. Because it's where your real self begins to whisper. For the first time, the ego doesn't die in a fire, it dies in silence. Not with screams, but with stillness. Carl Jung didn't promise that awakening would bring clarity. He warned that it would bring collapse. But not the kind of collapse you see in the movies. It's quieter than that, slower, more like a building where all the lights turn off one by one, until all that's left is the sound of your own breathing. Jung believed that true transformation wasn't about escaping the ego, but about confronting it. He said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And what is that darkness? It's not demons. Not past life karma. Not some external evil force. The darkness is what's left when the scaffolding of who you thought you were falls away. The career goals, the labels, the checklist of shoulds. It's the moment you realize you're no longer performing. But you're also not sure how to live without performing. That's not depression. That's psychological death. The ego hasn't disappeared. It's disoriented. Like a soldier who survived a war, only to come home and forget what peace feels like. You see, your ego was the engine that once drove you. It gave you reasons, it set goals, it wanted to win. And even though it exhausted you, it also gave you something that looked like momentum. But awakening takes the wheel out of the ego's hands. And now, it's just sitting in the passenger seat, confused, still trying to do, but no longer knowing why. And when that confusion sets in, motivation dissolves. Not because you're broken, but because the old engine isn't compatible with the new terrain. Imagine living your whole life in a house, and one day, you realize it's just a movie set. The walls are hollow. The windows aren't real. And as the set collapses, you're left in the open air. No script, no director, just the unknown. Jung didn't call this failure. He called it initiation, a kind of sacred dismantling. The death of who you had to be, to make room for who you actually are. But here's the part most people misunderstand. Just because the ego is no longer driving doesn't mean it disappears. Jung warned us, if you skip this stage, if you try to bypass it or rush through it, you don't transcend the ego. You fracture it. And that fracture shows up as spiritual bypassing, as disconnection, as false detachment. It shows up as the person who knows all the truths, but can't get out of bed. As the one who preaches about light, but hasn't made peace with their own darkness. You see, awakening isn't a finish line. It's a psychological earthquake. And the ground has to settle before you can walk again. That's what this part is. You're not unmotivated. You're between worlds. One foot still in the game you no longer want to play. One foot reaching for something that hasn't yet revealed itself. And in that space, the ego mourns. But the self, the deeper part of you, begins to awaken. And its voice is softer, slower, not a push, but a pull. The question is, will you stay still long enough to hear it? There's a place that almost no one talks about. Not the teachers, not the spiritual influencers, not the self-help podcasts. It's the space after awakening, but before becoming. A kind of no man's land. You've left the old world, the striving, the proving, the pleasing. But you haven't yet stepped fully into the new one. And in between, there's silence. You don't know what you're supposed to do. You don't even know who you are. The masks have fallen, yes. But so have the mirrors. There's no Reflection left to confirm who you've become. Jung understood this in a way that few modern thinkers have. He called it the liminal space, a space between identities, between stages, a sacred pause. But here's the hard part. In our world, stillness is misunderstood. Rest is labeled as laziness. Reflection is mistaken for avoidance. And so, you judge yourself. You look around at people chasing goals, building brands, grinding through life, and you wonder, what's wrong with me? But you're not broken. You're just not pretending anymore. The truth is, you've outgrown the roles, and you're waiting for the new ones to find you. But waiting is uncomfortable, because the ego wants action. It wants clarity. It wants a checklist. The self, on the other hand, wants truth. And truth often arrives in whispers. This space you're in? It's not a setback, it's a gestation. Like the caterpillar that turns into goo inside the cocoon. Not a bug anymore. Not a butterfly yet. Just goo. That's where you are. The form has dissolved. The new shape is still being written. And, yes, goo doesn't hustle. Goo doesn't post life updates. Goo doesn't crush it. It dissolves. This phase is hard, not because you're lost, but because you're between. And in that between, the mind panics. Because it can't control what it can't define. But the soul knows. It remembers. That transformation isn't loud, it's cellular. It's the kind of change that rearranges everything quietly, from the inside out. Jung believed this pause wasn't a detour. It was essential. Without it, the new self has no soil to grow in. So if you're here, in the goo, floating in the formless space between who you were and who you're becoming, don't rush. Don't numb it. Don't label it. This is not the void. This is the womb. And what's coming next isn't just a new goal, it's a new you. And that takes time. Not every awakening leads to clarity. Some lead to confusion. Some lead to collapse. And worse, some lead to illusion dressed as enlightenment. We live in a world where spiritual language is everywhere. Social media is full of words like alignment, soul purpose, vibration, manifestation. But no one tells you about the middle. That strange in-between where nothing makes sense. Where you're not chasing anymore, but you're not living yet. Where your old life is too small, but the new one hasn't shown up. And in that gap, a trap appears. The trap of bypassing. Jung warned about this long before hashtags were invented. He saw that if we try to skip the discomfort, if we try to rush the stillness, we don't awaken, we dissociate. We trade one illusion for another, this time, wrapped in robes and ritual. Instead of feeling our grief, we raise our frequency. Instead of integrating our shadows, we call them bad energy. Instead of sitting in the womb, we decorate it with affirmations and try to pretend we're already reborn. But no amount of journaling or incense can replace the raw, holy ache of becoming. The truth is, awakening is not always beautiful. It's awkward. It's messy. It's deeply unmarketable. That's why no one posts about this phase. Because sitting on your floor at 2 a.m., wondering who you are, doesn't get likes. But Jung saw that as the real work. The in-between, the unglamorous middle. That's where transformation either roots or rots. If you deny your confusion, you bury your rebirth. If you sugarcoat your silence, you never hear your soul speak. Jung called this bypassing of the hard parts a spiritual inflation. When the ego sneaks back in through the back door, this time wearing a white robe, it says, nothing matters. It's all just a dream. But the truth? You still live in a body. You still feel things. And you're not here to escape life. You're here to live it fully from a place that's real. The self doesn't reject reality. It reclaims. It doesn't float above suffering. It makes space for it. And that's the paradox. True awakening doesn't numb you. It cracks you open. Not to feel less, but to feel more honestly. So if you've been floating, detached, disconnected, calling it peace, maybe it's time to come back. Not back to the ego, but back to earth, to your body, to your breath, to your very real, very raw human experience. Because you can't heal what you won't hold. And you can't become whole if you're only willing to sit with the light. Imagine this, you're a caterpillar. Your whole life you've crawled, leaf to leaf, task to task, goal to goal. It's predictable, safe, mechanical, but then something shifts. A signal deep in your cells says, it's time. So, you stop crawling, you hang upside down. You wrap yourself in stillness. And then you dissolve, literally. Inside the cocoon, your body turns to goo, not wings, not beauty, not flight. Just formless floating goo. And that, right there, is where you are. You've stopped crawling. You've let go of your old roles, your old drive, your old illusions. But the wings, they haven't grown yet. And now you're goo. And goo doesn't hustle. Goo doesn't manifest a 5-year vision board. Goo dissolves. And the ego? It hates this part because there's nothing to perform, nothing to control, no identity to reinforce. In this goo phase, everything old melts, but the new hasn't taken shape. So what rises up instead? Panic. The ego whispers, do something, prove something, be someone, but the self says, let go. I'm building something deeper. Jung understood this tug of war. He called it enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposite. When you've spent your life driven by doing, awakening pulls you toward being. From striving to stillness, from proving to presence, from chasing to listening. This isn't failure. It's the balancing of a system that has been overstimulated for too long. The pendulum doesn't stop in the middle. It swings wide into the opposite. And this swing is sacred. It's the body's way of recalibrating. The soul's way of demanding space. But in our hyper-productive culture, stillness is almost always pathologized. Pause is mistaken for paralysis. Quiet is labeled depression. And so, you judge yourself. You start to believe something's wrong with you. But nothing is wrong. You are goo. And goo is not glamorous. It doesn't inspire hashtags or motivational speeches. But it's necessary. It's where the blueprint for the butterfly gets written. Quietly, invisibly. Cell by sacred cell. So if your life feels like it's melting, it probably is. Not because it's broken, but because something unimaginably honest is trying to form underneath. And that formation doesn't happen through effort. It happens through surrender, through allowing, through grieving, through trusting the darkness, even when you have no idea where it leads. The world tells you to move faster, to pivot, to heal, to get back out there. But your soul, it's asking for something slower, something quieter, not a breakthrough, but a breakdown of everything that was built on noise. The silence you're sitting in, that pause, that uncomfortable limbo between what was and what will be, that is not failure. That is initiation. Carl Jung believed that this stage, this psychological suspension, was not a mistake. It was a requirement. Because true transformation isn't just about seeing the light. It's about surviving the dark. He called this state a necessary tension. A phase where motivation vanishes, not because you've lost your way, but because your old operating system is shutting down to install something deeper. And yes, it can feel like nothing is happening, like you're wasting time. But beneath the surface, your psyche is busy. Like the ocean, still on top, but churning beneath. You're metabolizing old dreams, shedding false identities. Letting go of ambitions that were never really yours. The goals you no longer care about, that's not apathy. That's evolution. And Jung, he warned that in modern life, we fear this sacred pause. We diagnose it as depression. We label it as burnout. But sometimes, it's simply grief. The grief of losing the version of yourself you spent a lifetime building. Just to realize it wasn't actually you. And grief doesn't follow a timeline. It doesn't produce results, but it clears space. And that space? That's gold. In alchemy, Jung saw transformation not as a metaphor, but as a literal psychological process. Lead turning into gold. Ego dissolving into self. And that in-between goo stage? That's the furnace. The fire you sit in, not to be punished, but to be purified. So when your motivation fades, when your direction disappears, don't panic. Don't force a new vision just to feel in control. Stay in the fire. Let it burn away what no longer fits. Because what's forming, beneath the stillness, beneath the silence, is not a plan. It's a presence. And once that presence becomes clear, you won't need to push anymore. You'll feel pulled. Not by fear, not by ego, but by something much older, much quieter, much more true. That pull. That's where the real journey begins. Something subtle begins to shift. It doesn't start with fireworks. It doesn't come as an aha moment. It begins like a whisper, a quiet nudge, a soft pull. Not toward your old life, but toward something you can't fully name yet. For weeks, maybe months, you've been floating, unanchored, directionless. But now, something stirs. Not pressure, not urgency, just a simple curiosity, to write, to walk, to reach out, not to prove anything, but to respond. This is where the self begins to emerge, not as a thought, not as a role, but as a presence. Jung didn't see the self as some vague spiritual idea. He saw it as a living center within us, the organizing principle of wholeness. And unlike the ego, which constantly needs validation, the self is not interested in status or success, or even clarity. The self wants truth. The self wants alignment. And when it finally gets the space to lead, it begins to reject any fake ambition, fake goals, fake relationships. Even that dream board you made 3 years ago, the one that once lit you up, suddenly feels irrelevant. Not wrong, just not you anymore. That's not regression. That's recalibration. Because the self doesn't chase, it listens. And when it moves, it doesn't rush. It resonates. You begin to notice something. You're drawn to create, even when no one's watching. You say no to things, even when they look good on paper. You feel energy return, but this time, it's calm, grounded. Not the kind that burns you out, but the kind that fuels you quietly. This is the self's motivation. Not to impress, but to express. Not to gain, but to align. This is where you stop searching for the big purpose, and you start responding to what feels quietly honest. You stop asking, what should I do to prove myself? And start asking, what wants to move through me right now? This shift is profound. Because for the first time, your energy comes from within, not from fear, not from urgency, not from performance, but from presence. And from presence comes peace. Not the kind of peace that makes everything perfect, but the kind that makes everything real. So what now? You've walked through the dark. You've sat in the stillness. You've let go of the old fire that once burned so brightly and so loudly. And in its place, a quieter flame has begun to rise, not the flame of chasing, but the glow of alignment. Carl Jung called this way of living the symbolic life. Not symbolic as in metaphor, but symbolic as in sacred. A life where you're no longer just reacting to the world, but responding to the deep inner resonance of your own soul. Where dreams aren't just random, they're messages. Where synchronicities aren't coincidences, they're invitations. Where What you feel in your gut matters more than what others say on paper. This is what it means to be guided from within. Not by fear, not by conditioning, but by what Jung called the self, the internal compass that doesn't shout, it hums. And once you begin to live this way, something unexpected happens. You stop asking, what should I be doing? And instead ask, what's quietly calling me today? You stop measuring success by output and start noticing where your presence naturally wants to flow. The world may still expect performance, but you're no longer performing, you're participating. You're in the play, but you're no longer acting. You're creating, not from pressure, but from presence, saying yes to what feels real, saying no to what sounds good but feels false. And in doing so, you begin to trust something deeper. That you are not here to impress, you are here to express. That your path is not supposed to look like anyone else's, because your symbols, your dreams, your nudges are speaking a language written just for you. So when the world asks, where have you been? You can say, becoming, not striving, not escaping. Just remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. And if you're still unsure, still a little quiet inside, that's okay. Because the self doesn't scream. It waits until you're ready to listen. And when you do, that's when the real story begins. If this spoke to something inside you, if it gave language to what you've been silently carrying, then maybe you're not alone in this journey. Maybe your path, as quiet and invisible as it's been, is more universal than you thought. And if you want to keep walking through it with presence, with depth, with meaning, this channel exists for that. For people like you who don't just want more information, but want to understand what's really happening beneath the surface. So if something in you whispered yesterday, subscribe. Not to follow another voice, but to stay close to your own.